Quilt pattern testing is a fun and easy way to improve your skills as a quilter, as well as meeting other quilters from around the world. But what is it like to actually be a quilt pattern tester? In this video, I'm going to be sharing my experiences of testing over 18 patterns in 2021. And I'm going to be sharing some helpful tips that are going to get you started on your journey if you're thinking about becoming a pattern tester. Hi, my name's Tom and I'm the ColourBlind Quilter, and you are watching Reflective January on my channel, and today we are talking about quilt pattern testing. In 2021, one of my goals as a quilter was to level up some of the skills that I had, as well as trying some new things that I had never tried before. And while searching, I came across the perfect way to do this, and that was quilt pattern testing. Through this allowed me to try new things I had never done before, as well as homing and refining skills that I currently had that maybe needed a little bit of work. It also exposed me to a range of construction methods for building quilts that I had never experienced before, and gave me so many great experiences and ideas when it comes to making quilts. So let's get started then. This essentially is where you take a designer's quilt pattern and make it, and during the process you're checking things like the fabric requirements, the cutting instructions, the step-by-step instructions for constructing the quilt, and any other information that the quilt designer has supplied. It's not just unique to quilting, it's done in other industries like crochet, knitting, garment design, and it's essentially a way for a designer to check their pattern before they release it for publication into the wider sewing world. So what usually happens is that after you've signed up and been accepted, a designer will send you a PDF of their quilt pattern and instructions on what they need from you. You go through the pattern, make the quilt, taking notes as you go on anything that you find. Sometimes you're asked to provide the feedback as you work your way through the quilt, and other times you're asked to provide the feedback at the end of the test. You take pictures of your progress and then of the completed quilt at the end, which you submit to the designer. Depending on the pattern designer's wishes, you may share it on social media and your website, but they usually do include instructions as part of the design test process. And most pattern testers will have a quilt parade on the day that their pattern launches and showcase some of the possibilities of their pattern. So for starters, if you're actually interested in writing your own quilt patterns, this is a great experience that's going to help you with that. It's a great way to interact with other designers and see how they design and write their quilt patterns. It gives you an opportunity to try new techniques and new methods for things that you may have never done before. So you may have never done curved piecing before, and you take on a beginner's curved piecing pattern to test, and that's a great way to introduce yourself to the skill of curved piecing. It also allows you to refine current skills that you already have. You get to make more quilts. So if you're into quilting maths, it's a great way for you to flex your math muscles and check fabric requirements and cutting instructions to make sure that everything is correct. So it allows you to then further build your quilt math skills. If you're looking to gain exposure on social media, it can be a great way to have your work exposed to another designer's audience. More often than not, these designers will have large audiences where they'll share your work with credit. So this can be a great way to pick up some followers and gain exposure. It's also a great way to build relationships with designers and other quilters out there in the internet land. And of course, it's always nice to be part of a group that's all working on the same project at the same time. Some of the pattern designers will even set up Facebook or Instagram groups where you can stay in touch and you can chat with your fellow testers, sharing tips and advice that are going to help you with the testing process. And this is a great way to make new friendships and meet new people. And it exposes you to other quilters and their thoughts about colour and fabric pools. And this allows you to see how other people tackle picking fabrics for quilts, and can give you inspiration on when it comes to picking your own quilts. So perhaps the most obvious, pattern testing does involve a considerate amount of time, finances and resources in making a quilt. Buying fabric is expensive, and not to mention the time commitment required to make it. Some quilts could take 50 to 100 hours to construct for a pattern test. Chances are you will not get paid for being a pattern tester, although this is something that is starting to change because there is people in the community that are speaking out about this and are trying to make sure that pattern testers are treated as well as they can be. But you may find that you get reimbursements towards the cost of fabric. You may find that they offer you gift vouchers for their other products, courses or patterns that they sell. More often than not though, these will never cover the true cost of the project. For the majority of tests, do not expect to be fully reimbursed. Turnarounds can be tight when it comes to pattern testing. You may be used to making quilts in your own time, taking weeks or months to make them, but often pattern designers are on a schedule for publication. Most designers tend to be very organized and can give 4 to 8 weeks to complete a pattern test. Others will give you very little time at all. If you're not comfortable or not very good at checking a pattern for mistakes, you may find that you end up wasting fabric and therefore wasting money. If something's not right and you don't pick it up, you may go ahead and cut something and then end up wasting it. It can be highly frustrating when you get an email saying pattern version 2 2, only to discover that they've changed the sizes of all the strips that you have just cut from the fabric by 3/4 of an inch. Unless specified, usually you are required to stick to the pattern as it's written. So that means no shortcuts, no time savers. You know, if they want you to make one at a time half square triangles, then you have to follow those instructions. Otherwise, you're not really doing a pattern test, you're just making a quilt using your own methods. And this is important because if you don't follow the instructions, you can't pick up on mistakes, and therefore you're not actually helping the pattern designer. But on the other foot, they may also ask you to do construction methods that you've never done before. They may ask you to make 32 at a time half square triangles, and you may not be comfortable doing that. And then finally, when you do test for some of the bigger names in the design world, they may be asking for you to sign a non-disclosure agreement where you are asked to keep all the details of the quilt pattern test confidential. You're agreeing not to disclose anything until the time that they state that it's allowed. And in some cases, it may never be allowed depending on who the pattern is for. However, it is fun when you're doing work for the big designers because you get an insight into their business and how they write patterns and how they conduct pattern testing. So if you are interested in the pattern design business, they can be great for your own experiences. Some designers may also ask you to sign a contract, which in itself is not a problem, but I would always be wary and make sure you know exactly what you're signing and exactly what you're agreeing to before you sign anything. So in 2021, I set out to do 6 pattern tests as my New Year's resolution, and I ended up completing 18 pattern tests by the time I got to December. I've made everything from baby-sized quilts to twin-sized quilts, table runners, wall hangings, and even a Christmas stocking. I had the pleasure of testing for small designers who were just starting out with the very first pattern, to well-established designers who had published books and patterns for many years and had fairly large followings on social media and YouTube. Not dropping any names, but I have tested for Natalia Bonner. I found myself testing for a couple of designers 2 or 3 times and made it onto their trusted list of pattern testers that were reliable and delivered. When it came to the actual patterns, I had a wide variety of experiences with these. There were patterns that were so well written and so well put together that testing was a complete and utter breeze. There was no mistakes, there was no typos, there was no confusion in the instructions or fabric requirements, and it was just so easy from start to finish. On the other hand, I have had patterns that have been full of mistakes that were confusing to follow because the mistakes had labeled fabrics wrong, or they had mistakes in the cutting and fabric requirements that meant things did not turn out the right size. When it came to the bulk of patterns, most of the designers that I worked with expected you to share progress shots during the actual test without revealing the full quilt top that was reserved for them on the day of their launch. You would be expected to post between 2 and 6 progress updates, snippets of blocks or bits of fabric cut on your mat arranged nicely using various hashtags that they had selected and being sure to tag them in it. And then on launch day, you were expected to share your completed quilt top using hashtags and again tagging the designer. And then depending on the number of pattern testers that were involved in their test, they would have a quilt testers parade over maybe 1, 2 or 3 days until everybody's tests had been shared on their social media feeds. One of the tests even went so far to include pictures of completed quilts as part of their pattern and also as part of the pictures that were used to sell the pattern on their Etsy shop. So that was great as well because they were all credited. One of the pattern tests that I did do, however, was not for sharing, and they were very specific about that. You were not allowed to share any progress updates or any pictures of the completed quilt until they had made the formal announcement for the online course that followed that quilt. So that was top secret and everything was kept under wraps until they had posted and given permission to go ahead. But then once permission was given, you were free to post whatever you liked. One thing I did like very much was that quite a few designers set up Instagram groups with testers, and that would allow us to chat, to share tips, to share anything that we had discovered in the pattern straight away so that you didn't necessarily waste fabric or cut things wrong. And it was lovely chatting to people, getting to know other quilters from around the world, getting their experience and their advice on how to do certain parts of a pattern if they weren't familiar. When it came to compensation for 2 of the patterns that I tested, I received reimbursement towards fabric costs, not the full fabric costs, but a token amount that was fairly generous. For one other of the tests, I received a gift voucher that could be used to purchase books or patterns or online courses from the designer's website. However, for the rest of the patterns, it was just merely exposure on their social media channels. And that was fine for the majority of them because most of them were bigger than me. But for the designers that were smaller than me, it maybe wasn't as much exposure. However, it's still good to get your work out in front of many people as possible because you never know who might see something. I would say that my experiences were 96% positive with all the designers that I worked with. They were all very friendly, they were all very helpful, willing to answer questions, to give you advice and guidance guidance if you were a little bit stuck. And on the whole, I felt that they were very grateful and thankful for the work that you were doing to help make their pattern better. I did have one bad experience with the pattern test. I got the dates wrong. I was a day late submitting my finished work, and I think you probably just spaced it because of time zones, but you know, my fault for getting it wrong. But that person was running a competition where they were asking their followers to vote on their favorite pattern test, and then the tester was going to win a prize. I think I was the only tester that was outside of the US, so this may or may not be a coincidence, but because I was a day late, I was excluded from the competition, and I was given no credit at all in any testers parades or any credit for anything else. It was almost as if I had never done the test at all, and that was that. I guess completely my fault. I missed a deadline, but I do think it was probably down to just time zones being outside of the US. I just spaced it and thought that it was my time zone, but I do feel that was perhaps a slight overreaction from the designer. I will say though, it might be a bit bitchy, but it was the worst written pattern out of all the tests. It was full of mistakes. It was full of confusing instructions. Figures were mixed up, the fabric. Yeah, I think that's enough about that. It was not a great test. And needless to say, when that designer came knocking to do a second pattern test for them that was very secret and very short, I did politely tell them to get lost. The one downside I will add about pattern testing, and this is not necessarily the fault of pattern testers, more my own fault, was taking on more than I could chew at one time. At one stage I was doing 4 quilt pattern tests at once, and they were all in fairly quick succession. I think I had 3 due within the space of 2 weeks, and these were full-size quilts. And procrastinating and, oh, I'll start that tomorrow, or not wanting to cut fabric, that kind of anxiety we feel before we start a project, found myself up late sewing, all night sewing, all day sewing. When it came to one of the tests, I was so flustered. It was paper templates that I had never done before. It was not a complicated pattern. I was just flustered and not paying attention. You had to make something like 85 blocks that came together, or 85 or 86 blocks that came together to make larger blocks. And I think I had made around 25 before I realized I had done wrong, and that there was supposed to be like an A and a B version that were mirrored, and when you were cutting it, you were supposed to twist the template to make the B version, and I had twisted it the wrong direction. So when I spoke to the designer, I realized my mistake. Luckily, I had plenty of fabric because I had ordered just a little bit extra, and I basically had to spend an entire day making all these quilt blocks, and I ended up managing to make something like 50 of these in a 16-hour shift of sewing, and I was exhausted the next day. When you get to that level of tiredness, you start to make silly mistakes, things that you don't normally do, but you're just so tired, but you've got the pressure, like, I need to meet the deadline, I need to meet the deadline. And that was stressful, and that was my own fault for putting myself into that position by taking on more than I could chew. And I think it just stemmed from the fact that I just couldn't say no. Maybe slightly addicted to pattern testing, maybe, or just generally just being more confident in my abilities than I actually realized, because I do have full-time work as well, so you know, I can't often spend an entire day sewing when, you know, I have work to do. So that's my fault, not a quilt designer's fault, just being too excited, being too enthusiastic, and just taking on way too much. So that's my only downside, I think, of it. But on the whole, I loved the experience, and so much so that I'm continuing to pattern test into 2022. However, because I've done so many of them now, I don't feel the need to take on as many of them. I've got a really good handle on how it works. I've been exposed to many different designers from around the world who have very different ways and methods of doing things, so it's given me lots of experiences that I can now take forward into my own quilting and into my own pattern design. So I think for this year, I'm probably going to do 3 or 4 tests. And in fact, I've already been signed up for 2 tests for the designer that I worked with 3 times last year. So this will be my 4th and 5th test for this designer. And their work is beautiful. They have some amazing quilts that are really just, as soon as I see them, I'm like, oh, I have to test that because I want to make it. So I'm excited to be testing for them. So when I've been posting things on Instagram, I usually get messages from people saying, where did you see this test? How can I find tests? How can I take part in pattern testing? So my usual advice is that you need to watch on Instagram and Facebook and quilt designers' websites, because that is where they will post tester calls. There are hashtags on Instagram that you can follow that they will post in, and I follow these and just see anything coming up, and then I will get in touch with them. You will find that there are trends for certain time of year. June, July, August time is when Halloween patterns come out. September, October time is when Christmas patterns come out. November, December is when you start to see Valentine's Day patterns come out, and so on. So there are kind of times of the year where things start to come out as people are designing for specific things during the year. Some designers actually have mailing lists, and if you go to their website, you can sign up to be on their mailing list for pattern testers, and they will release them into that mailing list when they have a pattern that's ready for testing. But I will say this, these spots go fast. I have seen tests that have been up for 40 minutes and they are full. I've seen people put a test up and they get completely overwhelmed by the number of responses that they get, that it takes them a long time to go through them all and to pick the people. So when you see a test, you've got to be prepared to move fast, particularly if it's something you really want to do. But there are situations where tests will come and go, and by the time you see it, it's already full. Don't be discouraged, just be organized. Following those hashtags, be on the mailing lists, be on the lookout on their social media, because they'll often post teasers saying upcoming pattern test in the next 2 weeks, look at this. So just keep an eye on it and be prepared for when they might be potentially releasing new tests or calls. But don't be discouraged if you don't get picked the first couple of times. The bigger a designer is, the more people that they will have applying to take part in their tests. You may not get selected because they've got thousands of people applying, or you may get selected because they've only had 2 people applying. Either way though, it's still good experience. If you're on social media is your portfolio of work, so have a think about that when you're posting. I think all of the tests that I have done have asked for my Instagram handle, and they've been looking at my account to see how I post pictures of my quilts, what kind of quilter I am, what kind of colors I use, does it kind of fit with what they're looking for in their pattern tester, because bear in mind, these test quilts are publicity for their pattern and show possibilities that you can make. So often or not, they're looking to see how good you are. So if you're not very good at photography and your pictures are a bit crap, you may find that you could be the best quilter in the world, but you don't get picked because they don't feel like you're going to showcase their work in a good manner. So just take that into consideration when you are posting on Instagram or social media, to take the best pictures that you can, have good lighting, have a variety of different shots, a close-up shot of stitching, a shot across the quilt, a shot of the full size of the quilt, a shot of the quilt but with the back folded over so they can see the quilting on the back, maybe close-up shots of the binding or any unique features that you have while you've been making that quilt. Just bear these all in mind, because they will look at your Instagram feed and they will say yes or no sometimes just on seeing that. So photography is a big thing. Quilting is a visual art. You may want to read up on taking pictures of your quilts to get some advice and guidance on how to take better pictures if you're not that great at it. And I certainly am not that great at it, so I take all the help I can get. And then finally, I think this piece of advice might be common sense, but I'm going to share it anyway, is to always do your best work. As I've said, some of these designers can have massive followings on Instagram, and when they share your work with credit, you never know who's actually going to see your work or where it might reach. You never know what opportunities may come out of that. So it's in your interest to do the best work that you possibly can. I know that I've had 2 or 3 opportunities that have come up through my pattern testing. So do the best to your abilities, post the best picture you can to your abilities, be polite, be friendly, be on time, and just do your best work. So here's some tips on success when it comes to pattern testing. And some of these may or may not apply to the test depending on the setup of the test. So start by making a note of all the dates and get them on a calendar or somewhere that you can see them so you know what deadlines are and when they are due. I highly advise you to read and then reread the pattern before you touch any fabric to pick up any initial mistakes. Make a note of any specific feedback requirements or any methods of feedback that the designer has asked you to do. Sometimes designers ask you to test a specific size of pattern, so make sure you know what size of pattern you're testing. Nothing worse than making a baby quilt when they're expecting you to make a king size quilt. A lot of times they will take on a number of people to do each size, so you just need to make sure that you make the right size. Make a note of any social media commitments or publicity requirements that the designer has asked for, hashtags to use, a number of progress pictures, or indeed don't share anything until they give you the go-ahead or they've shared the project. Make sure you know how the designer wants feedback. Some designers are happy for you to just send an email. Some are looking for a Word document. Some designers who are very organized have forms for each page and each section of the pattern where they ask you to put your feedback into that. Other pattern designers are happy for you just to write and scan on the PDF. So just make sure you know which it is that they prefer. When it comes to it, I like to do 2 things for my feedback. I print the pattern and then I write on it, and then I will take all that and I will type it into a Word document, or I will write it onto a PDF, and then I will share whichever is appropriate with the designer. When you're giving the feedback, try and be as specific as possible. Don't just be like, that instruction for making that HST is wrong. Try and be specific. On page number 5, number 1, figure A, this is wrong direction, or words to that effect. Be specific so that it's helpful to the designer. I have mentioned this already, but don't take on more tests than you can handle at one time. It can create stress that you don't need, and it can take some of the fun out of the process. So be realistic in what you can actually sew and make and the time and deadlines that they have set. I would advise, if it's appropriate to the pattern, that you make a test block before you commit to cutting all your fabric, because usually by the time you've made a test block, somebody else has been through the entire pattern to check it and has come back with this requirement's wrong, that strip is the wrong size, and it can just save you a bit of stress and upset Be realistic about the size of quilt that you can make. The bigger the quilt, the more expensive it is and the harder it is to deal with. So if you've only ever made baby quilts, jumping into a king-size quilt, whilst is not impossible, it could be more stressful than you anticipate. So just be realistic about what size of quilt you can comfortably handle. I have turned down several tests because a designer has been looking for somebody to test a king-size quilt, and I have no desire to be making quilts that big because it's just so difficult to deal with them, especially when it comes to the quilting. They're so big and so cumbersome, I don't need that in my life. So I tend to stick to twin size and smaller, unless it's really a design that I really like, and then I would consider it, perhaps. But it'd have to be really good. And finally, do not be scared to say no. And I think this was my problem when I first started, is that I just couldn't say no. If somebody asked me to test something, I was delighted to be considered because I saw it as they like my work. Now I'm a lot more selective and I have no problem saying, thank you for considering me, but I'm really sorry I can't meet your deadlines. So please do keep me on your list for future tests, but at this time it's a no. And that's perfectly fine, and I'm sure that a designer will respect you more for that than saying yes and then not being able to deliver. Be aware that every pattern test is different. Some are very ad hoc and relaxed, whereas a lot of them are very structured and have groups and ways of feeding back. So just be aware that not everything will be the same. Some will be more organized than others. If you're not comfortable checking quilting maths requirements for cutting things or fabric requirements, then I suggest you wait a few days after getting the pattern, if you can, to allow the people that are quick at checking these things to zoom through it and then get back to the designer. And that could save you some heartache when it comes to fabric. It can be stressful with tight deadlines. There's a mindset of wanting to quilt, having fun, versus I need to quilt, I need to make this quilt. And that can be very stressful, and it can encourage you to sew long hours where you get tired and you make mistakes and you have to unpick things and you get more frustrated and tired, and it can start to just suck the joy out of it. So just be wary of taking on too much at one time. In the same vein, only take on tight deadlines if you can actually meet them. If somebody wants feedback in 7 days, that's incredibly short. So just be cautious about the deadlines, because some designers will set very tight deadlines just because they want the feedback quickly. You have to also think about if you actually have the fabric. During the pandemic, when everything was shut down, I was relying on fabric shops shipping fabric quickly, and if there was any form of delay in me receiving the fabric, that ate into my sewing time and meant that I would be rushing to the finish line. So just be aware of what you have and what you have access to in short turnaround. Usually designers can be quite good if you need a day or two extra, but they can start to get frustrated when you're a week, 2, 3 weeks past the deadlines, and often will just give up waiting for you. You know, they have their own deadlines. They could be writing for a magazine and have a submission deadline. They could have printing deadlines to get pattern printed. It's not just you, there's also their deadlines that they have to meet on their side of their business. And then just be aware, you cannot share these patterns with other people, and most designers are very specific about this, but just in case they aren't, you are not meant to share these patterns with anybody. There are exceptions though, that some designers, when they send the final pattern out, will say to you, you may share this with one quilting friend. But unless you're told that, do not share these patterns, because that's just rude. So keep it to yourself unless otherwise specified. Just quick fire questions for you to just give you some very quick information, because I like doing this, so let's go. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Most often they don't. You need all the general things that you would use for quilting: sewing machine, thread, fabric, quilting notions, cutter, cutting mat, rulers, pins. It depends on what kind of quilt it is. You may need a variety of things, but usually they will tell you that in advance. Probably not, although that is changing. You may get compensated with reimbursements towards fabric costs, gift vouchers to buy notions, books, courses from the designer, but I wouldn't expect somebody to say, here's $1,000 for testing my pattern yet. It varies from tests. Sometimes it can be 7 days, sometimes it can be 8 weeks. Just depends on the designer and their own deadlines. Browse Instagram, social media, Facebook, find designers, look at Quilt Pattern Mart and look at designers on there and find their websites, see if you can sign up to mailing lists for testers, find hashtags that you can follow where testers post calls for testers, and be ready to move fast. Usually the designers will give you a choice of what design size that you make. Other times they will be very specific and put the call out for twin size testers. So they will either tell you what size to make or they will give you free choice, and then it's up to you what size you pick. Usually they're looking for feedback about fabric requirements, cutting instructions, step-by-step instructions, figures in the pattern, if the construction methods make sense, if there's any grammar or spelling mistakes throughout the pattern, if anything's hard to follow, if anything's confusing, or if there's anything missing. That again depends on the pattern. All the tests I've done have not specified. It's just been a case of making the quilt top, but I do know people that have been in pattern tests where they've been expected to make the top quilt and bind the quilt. So do take that into consideration, because if it's a 10-day turnaround, doing an entire quilt from start to finish is a big project. Usually no, the designer will specify that you can do whatever you like, pick your own colors and pick your own fabrics, although often they will ask you to use the number of colors that are required in the pattern so that the pattern still turns out correct. But what I would say is that if you are in doubt, just ask the designer what they think and they will give you their feedback. Again, yes and no. I've never been told that I must use colors. I've always been told that I can use whatever I like. So if you're not sure, check with a designer. Usually yes, because it's a launch and they're building up to a launch, so you don't want to steal their thunder, but they will be specific about what they want to do, and some people have already posted it and therefore you're fine to post whatever you like. Other people just want you to post sneaky peeks and then wait for them to do the final reveal before you post yours. They will give you that information in the test as it starts. Just ask if you're not sure. No, no, no. So no, you can't share it with other people unless the designer specifically tells you. So if they don't specify, I wouldn't share it. Yes, I do. I think it's a great experience and I think you'll really enjoy it if you love making quilts. If you want to get into the business side of quilt, designing your own patterns, I think it's an invaluable experience for you. If you want to meet new people, I think again it's an invaluable experience. So yeah, I recommend everybody should probably do 1 or 2 tests just to see what it's like. It depends on the pattern that is being tested. You may need to be able to do curve piecing, English paper piecing. The designer will tell you what skills are required usually before they release the pattern to you, so you can say yes or no. And if you don't have the specific skill required, you then have to make a judgment call about whether you think you can learn it enough to make a decent quilt or whether it's going to be beyond you. You will be told by the designer when and how to send feedback and photos and how to name the files. Just make sure everything is clear, good lighting in the picture, good angles. Interesting pictures are always good as well because people like intakes on quilts. Some designers will give you access to a Dropbox or a Google Drive where you can upload your pictures to, so they will tell you what to do. So that was my video on pattern testing and my adventures, and I really hope that if you are considering getting into pattern testing, that some of those tips and advice have been helpful for you. In the next video in Reflective January, I'm going to be doing an online trunk show and I'm going to be showing you all of the patterns that I made in 2021. If you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up and then make sure you subscribe and click the bell so you get notified when I release more videos on this channel. So take care and I will see you next time.